Neighbors laughed at the orphan's primitive cave house until they discovered who really built it. Some secrets are kept not because they're shameful, but because the world isn't ready to understand them. 12-year-old Eli Dawson learned this truth standing alone at his father's grave while February wind cut through his worn jacket, watching the last person who ever loved him disappear into frozen ground. It began with an ending, the way most transformations do. The morning Eli's father didn't wake up was the morning everything collapsed into silence. Thomas Dawson had been a quiet man, a carpenter who built things with his hands and spoke more to wood than to people. He could look at a pile of lumber and see the table or chair hiding inside it. He'd raised Eli alone in a cabin at the edge of the Cascade foothills ever since Eli's mother died, bringing him into the world. 12 years of just the two of them against everything. 12 years of sawdust and wood shavings and pine sap. 12 years of learning that love didn't need many words when it had steady hands and patient teaching. They didn't have much. The cabin, a few acres of forest, Thomas's tools worn smooth by decades of use, and each other. For 12 years, that had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Then the coughing started. It began small, just a tickle that Thomas waved away, but it grew and deepened and turned wet in a way that made Eli's stomach clench. Then came the blood. Then came the long nights when Eli would lie awake listening to his father's labored breathing, praying that morning would come and his father would still be in it. The doctor came once, a tired man who examined Thomas and spoke to Eli in words he probably thought were kind. Consumption, the doctor said. There were sanitariums, places Thomas could go, but Thomas refused. He was a Dawson, and Dawsons died at home, surrounded by the things they loved. He lasted 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of Eli bringing soup he couldn't eat. 3 weeks of watching the strongest man he'd ever known fade like morning frost. 3 weeks of conversations that tried to pack a lifetime into hours that slipped away too fast. Build something, Thomas whispered near the end, gripping Eli's hand. Promise me. Build something that lasts. That's how a man leaves his mark. I promise, Eli said, meaning it with every fiber of his being, even though he had no idea how to keep such a promise alone. Thomas died on a Tuesday. Eli sat beside him through that final night, and when the breathing stopped at dawn, he didn't cry. He was too empty. He just sat holding a hand that was growing cold, watching light change on the walls his father had built. The county sent a man 3 days after the funeral, a man in a gray suit with soft hands and a clipboard containing Eli's entire future. Eli watched from the corner while the man made notes and asked questions. How old are you? 12, sir. Any family? No, sir. Anyone who could take you in? No, sir. The man explained that Eli couldn't stay alone. There was a facility in Seattle, a good place, clean. Other children. They'd find him a proper family eventually. Eli nodded like he understood. Nodded right up until the man turned his back to make a phone call. Then he slipped out the kitchen door and ran. He ran until his lungs burned and the cabin was nothing but memory. He ran along paths his father had shown him, paths that weren't really paths, unless you knew how to read the forest. He ran until the sun began to set, and the temperature began to drop, and he realized he had nowhere to go. That first night nearly killed him. He found a hollow beneath a fallen log and stuffed it with pine needles and shivered until dawn. His father's voice echoed in his head, all the lessons about fire building and shelter making. But knowing and doing were different things. When your hands were shaking, and you were 12 years old, and completely alone. The second night was worse. The temperature dropped further, and his shelter wasn't enough. The wind found every gap. Somewhere around midnight, Eli accepted that he might not see another sunrise. He was too tired to be scared, too cold to cry. He just lay there listening to wind in the pines and waited for whatever came next. What came next was impossible. He heard it before he saw it. Heavy footsteps approaching, weight that made the ground vibrate. His first thought was bear. His second thought was that it didn't matter because he was too frozen to run. He closed his eyes and prepared for teeth and claws. Instead, he felt warmth. Something large settled beside his log, blocking the wind, radiating heat like a furnace. Eli's eyes flew open, but it was too dark to see anything except a massive shape. A wall of shadow that smelled like pine and musk and something wild but not threatening. The shape didn't attack, just stayed there, a barrier between Eli and death. Some instinct deeper than logic told him this thing meant no harm. He let his eyes close and slept. When dawn crept through the trees, Eli got his first clear look at what had saved him. The creature was enormous, 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark, reddish-brown fur that caught the early light like autumn leaves. Its shoulders were broader than any man's, its arms thick as tree trunks, its hands huge and powerful with fingers that could have crushed Eli's skull without effort. It sat watching him with an expression impossible to read, utterly still, patient as stone. But the eyes weren't animal eyes. They held depths, intelligence, something like wisdom accumulated over centuries of watching the world change around them. They studied Eli the way a person studies something new and interesting, with curiosity and assessment and a patience that spoke of time measured differently than humans measured it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the monster from campfire stories his father had always dismissed. Except it wasn't a monster. Monsters didn't save freezing children. Monsters didn't share their warmth with strangers. The creature made a sound low in its throat, almost a question. Eli's voice came out as a croak. "Thank you." The creature tilted its massive head. Then it rose to its full height and extended one huge hand toward him. Not threatening, offering, the way you'd help someone who'd fallen. Eli took the hand without hesitation. The grip was gentle despite its strength, careful in a way that spoke of awareness. It knew how fragile he was. It was choosing not to break him. What followed was the strangest journey of Eli's life. The creature led him through the forest, moving with impossible silence for something so large. They walked for hours, deeper into the mountains than Eli had ever been, until they reached a place that made him stop and stare. It was a cave, but not like any cave he'd seen. The entrance was sheltered by a natural overhang. The floor inside was packed earth, level and smooth, and at the back of the chamber, impossible and unmistakable, was a hearth. Not natural, a hearth built from stacked stones, with walls angled to reflect heat and a chimney channel carved into rock. Someone had built a fireplace inside this cave. Eli turned to look at the creature. Understanding passed between them, without words. "You live here," he said softly. The creature rumbled affirmation. "You built this." Another rumble, almost proud. Eli ran his fingers over the stones. The work was rough but solid, the work of intelligence. His father would have recognized a fellow builder. For the first time since the gray man appeared, Eli felt something other than grief. He felt hope. The creature let him stay. That was the beginning of everything. Eli slept in the cave that night, warmer than he'd been since leaving his cabin. When he woke, the creature was still there, watching, waiting, seeing what he would do. What he did was survive. And then, slowly, he did more than survive. He began to live. The creature taught him things without words. Which roots were edible, which streams stayed unfrozen, which parts of the forest held danger. It led him to caches of nuts and berries it had stored, sharing its supplies with generosity that made Eli's chest tight. But most importantly, it showed him how to build. The creature wasn't just living in the cave, it was constantly improving it. Over the following weeks, Eli watched it work, and what he saw changed everything he thought he knew. It gathered stones from the creek bed, selecting them with an eye for size and shape that would have impressed a mason. It fitted stones together without mortar, using gravity and geometry to create walls that locked themselves in place. It stripped bark from fallen trees and wove it into insulation, stuffing gaps with mud and pine needles that dried harder than concrete. It understood angles and load-bearing and thermal mass, not like engineers with calculations, but like someone who had learned by doing over more years than Eli could imagine. Eli helped where he could. His small hands were useful for tight spaces, for detailed work that massive fingers couldn't manage. They developed a rhythm of collaboration that felt natural. The creature would rumble a question and Eli would somehow understand. Eli would point to a problem and the creature would somehow see the solution. Together, over months, they transformed the cave into something extraordinary. The front wall went up first, proper fitted stone that turned the entrance into a real doorway. They framed a gap for a door with larger stones that could bear weight. Then Eli went back for his father's tools. It was a risk returning to the cabin, but he needed those tools. They were his father's, the last connection to the man who'd taught him everything. He went at night and found the cabin empty. He took the saw and hammer, the chisels and plane, blankets and the cooking pot, the small stash of money his father had hidden, his father's coat and boots and hat, all too big now, but things he would grow into. Then he walked away, without looking back. The door he built from salvaged lumber, using techniques his father had taught him. It wasn't pretty. Boards didn't quite match. Hinges improvised from bent nails and leather, but it was solid. It swung freely. It latched from inside. When Eli hung it for the first time, the creature made a sound he'd never heard before. Almost like laughter, almost like joy. They kept building. It became their shared purpose. They expanded the hearth, adding a raised platform for cooking. They built a stone bench that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it through cold nights. They dug a channel from an underground spring for fresh water. They added chambers for storage and sleeping. They started work on a workshop. They built through winter and into spring, through summer and back into fall. And somewhere in all that building, Eli realized he wasn't just making a shelter. He was making a home. He was keeping his promise. Build something that lasts. The townspeople started noticing in April. Eli had been careful, only going to town when absolutely necessary, always with a story about an uncle over the ridge. He'd learned to time his visits, early morning when the streets were quiet, or late afternoon when people were busy with their own concerns. He kept his head down and his answers short and his purchases practical. Flour, salt, nails, the things he couldn't make or find in the forest. But stories only worked for so long. People noticed patterns, people talked, and eventually someone got curious enough to follow. Marcus Peterson followed him one day, curious about the weird orphan who disappeared after his father's funeral. Marcus saw the cave. More importantly, he saw what the cave had become. Stone walls, wooden door, smoke curling from a chimney carved into rock. He saw something impossible and ran back to town with a story that spread like wildfire. After that, they came in groups. First kids, curious and disbelieving. Then adults, suspicious, convinced there must be some trick. They climbed the ridge to the cliff face and stood in front of the stone facade with its wooden door and glass window, real glass, salvaged from an abandoned farmhouse and fitted by Eli himself, and didn't know what to say. They called it primitive. They called it crude. They called it impossible. No way a child could have built such a thing alone. No way a 12-year-old orphan could have fitted those stones, carved that chimney, created something so obviously functional in the middle of nowhere. There must be someone helping him. Eli just shrugged and let them wonder. He gave tours when asked, answered questions with half-truths. Yes, he'd had help. No, they wouldn't meet his helper. No, he wasn't going to explain further. He couldn't tell them the truth. Couldn't explain that his helper stood 8 feet tall and was watching from the forest shadows even now, ready to protect, but careful not to be seen. Couldn't describe the low rumble of approval the creature made whenever they finished a new improvement. Couldn't explain the massive hand that sometimes rested on his shoulder with unmistakable pride. So he let them think it was a miracle. Let them laugh at first, then fall silent as they walked through the cave house and saw the craftsmanship up close. Let them shake their heads and mutter about genius children and things that defied explanation. The gray man came back in May. He stood at the entrance with his clipboard and disbelieving eyes, looking at stone walls and glass windows and rising smoke. "You can't stay here alone," he started, but his voice had no conviction. "This isn't proper. There are regulations." He couldn't find the words. None of them ever could. Eli stood before him with arms crossed and chin raised, no longer the frightened boy who'd run into the forest. "I'm warm. I'm fed. I'm safe. I'm not hurting anyone and I'm not asking for help. My father said a man is measured by what he builds. He'd be proud of what I've built here." The gray man left. He came back twice more over the years, each time with less conviction. Eventually, he stopped coming altogether. Maybe the county forgot about the orphan in the mountains. Maybe they decided he was someone else's problem. Maybe they looked at the impossible cave house and decided some mysteries were better left unsolved. Eli had a home. He had a purpose. And he had a friend the world would never understand. The creature stayed for 3 years. 3 years of building and learning and quiet companionship. 3 years of wordless conversations by the fire and shared meals of foraged mushrooms and roasted roots, and occasionally a rabbit or fish that the creature caught with those massive, impossibly quick hands. 3 years of long winter, nights when wind howled outside, and the hearth glowed warm inside, and Eli would talk about his father, about his mother he'd never known, about the life he'd lost and the life he was building. The creature would listen with those ancient eyes, and sometimes make sounds that felt like understanding, like comfort, like the kind of presence that doesn't need words to matter. 3 years of watching the creature work and slowly understanding its methods, absorbing knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries, becoming the inheritor of traditions that predated human civilization. Eli learned things no book could teach: how to read the grain of stone, how to feel when a wall was balanced, how to work with the mountain instead of against it. They added more rooms, a proper workshop where Eli could practice his father's craft, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside where food stayed cool in summer and didn't freeze in winter, a covered porch where Eli could sit and watch storms roll across the valley. Each project brought new lessons, new techniques, new understanding of how to work with stone and wood and earth. The creature never spoke in words Eli could understand, but they communicated nonetheless, a rumble of approval, a grunt of warning, a gesture toward a problem or a solution. Sometimes Eli would wake in the night to find the creature sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with those ancient eyes, and he would wonder what it was thinking, what memories it carried, what losses it had known. He never asked. Some questions were too big for the answers available. Then, one morning in Eli's 15th spring, he woke to find the creature gone. There was no goodbye, no warning, no explanation, just an empty space where a presence had been, a silence where there had been that low, reassuring rumble, a stillness in the cave that felt like grief made physical. Eli searched for days. He ranged further than he ever had before, following trails that might have been tracks and might have been wishful thinking, calling out in sounds that imitated the creature's language as best he could. But the forest kept its secrets. The mountains gave nothing back. Eventually, after weeks of searching that left him exhausted and empty, Eli accepted what his heart had known from that first silent morning. The creature had its own life, its own needs, its own journey that had intersected with Eli's for a while, but couldn't include him forever. It had stayed long enough to save him, to teach him, to help him build something that would last. Then it had moved on, the way wild things must, the way free things do. Maybe it had found others of its kind. Maybe it had simply grown restless, following some ancient pattern that had nothing to do with human concepts of goodbye. Maybe it had known somehow that Eli was ready to survive alone, ready to maintain what they'd built together, ready to be the keeper of secrets that the world would never understand. Eli would never know for certain, but he chose to believe the last option. He chose to believe that the creature had looked at him and seen someone strong enough to stand on his own, someone worthy of the knowledge it had shared, someone who would honor their work by continuing it. That belief was enough. It had to be. Eli stayed. He's still there, in fact, in the cave house that neighbors stopped laughing at years ago. He's 23 now, a man grown, with his father's broad shoulders and his father's steady hands, and something in his eyes that makes people look twice without knowing why. He's expanded the structure 3 times since the creature left, adding a proper workshop with a forge he built himself, a storage cellar dug deep into the rock, a bedroom with a real bed frame and a window that faces the sunrise. People come from all over the county to see it now. The impossible house that an orphan supposedly built alone. They come with cameras and notebooks and questions that Eli answers with the same half-truths he's been telling for a decade. Yes, he had help. No, they can't meet his helper. No, he won't explain further. They leave wondering, always wondering. Some write newspaper articles. Some take photographs that show up in magazines about alternative living and primitive skills. A few have offered him money for his story, serious money, the kind of money that could buy a real house in a real town with electricity and plumbing and all the things he's never had. Eli always refuses. What would he say? The truth would make him a liar in everyone's eyes. Or worse, would bring scientists and researchers and government officials with their questions and tests and desperate need to explain the unexplainable. The creature, wherever it is now, whatever vast wilderness it's walking through, deserves better than that. Their friendship deserves better. Some things are sacred precisely because they remain unspoken. Sometimes young people come to him, wanting to learn. Dreamers and misfits and runaways like he once was, looking for something they can't name. He teaches them what he can, the stonework, the insulation techniques, the way to read a forest for resources and dangers. He teaches them his father's carpentry and the creature's masonry and the 1,000 small skills that make survival possible in these mountains. He teaches them that building something with your hands can heal wounds that nothing else can reach. He never tells them where all the knowledge came from. He just passes it on, the way it was passed to him, trusting that they'll do the same someday. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the fire burns low and the forest outside falls into that particular silence that feels like listening, Eli hears something. Heavy footsteps in the snow, too rhythmic to be wind, too steady to be imagination. A low rumble that might be distant thunder except that the sky is clear and full of stars. A presence at the edge of the firelight, just beyond where vision can reach, watching with eyes that hold more depth than any animal's should. He never goes out to check. He doesn't need to. Some things don't require proof to be true. Some connections don't need constant contact to remain real. Some secrets are kept not because they're shameful, but because the world isn't ready to understand them, and because understanding isn't the point anyway. Love is the point. Gratitude is the point. Building something that lasts is the point. On those nights, Eli raises his hand to his chest and extends it outward toward the darkness, the gesture the creature taught him all those years ago. The gesture that means, I remember. The gesture that means, thank you. The gesture that means, you will always be welcome here, no matter how far you wander, no matter how many years pass, no matter what the world thinks about what's possible and what isn't. The darkness never responds in any way Eli can see or hear, but he feels something every single time. A warmth that isn't from the fire, a peace that isn't from the silence, a certainty that somewhere out there, in the wild places where humans fear to walk, a creature is raising its own massive hand to its own ancient chest, returning the gesture across miles and years, and the impossible gulf between their worlds. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.